Okay, back for today. Part 17. Right. Let's see where we are at. I think I'm good if I work on these flames a bit. I did a little bit on this coin stacks earlier. Probably could do a little bit more there. Maybe here. It's starting to look pretty done. So today I got an audiobook from LibriVox, The Heroic Life and Exploits of Siegfried, the Dragon Slayer. Yeah, it's 3 books. 3 hours. Let's see if we can get through it all.
strong in war, and 2 young companions to hew some trees for the handles of their spears. As evening drew on, the aged man seated himself on a high rock, whence he could
So listening to the heroic life and exploits of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer by Anonymous. I forgot to set my headphones on the streaming software, so missed 10 minutes of the beginning. I'll go back to
survey the country round, with its dark forests, its green meadows, and the golden fields of corn. He took one boy after another in turn upon his knee, held him firmly before him, and looked at him sternly, as if about to throw him over the precipice. The 2 other lads trembled at his angry look, as at a gleam of lightning. But Siegfried gazed on him with a fearless smile and open eye, like a young falcon when looking for the first time at the sun. The old man set him down and was pleased, for he felt that the blood of the ancient heroes flowed in the boy's veins, and that he would one day in like manner look with a steady eye upon the flaming swords when they should gleam around him. One of the boys looked at the goats that grazed near them, the other looked up at the wild fruits of the forest, but Siegfried remained seated on the old warrior's knee, playing with the handle of the hero's sword, which his young hands could scarcely lift. Then said one of the boys, as he looked at the wild landscape before him, "Now, if I had anything to wish for, it should be that all the valley of the Rhine, from the lofty mountains in the south to the sea in the north, were one large field of grain, and that I had in every part my farmyards and granaries and barns, so that no king might be richer than I. And I," said the other boy, "would wish that the whole vale beneath us were one vast meadow, and that my herds, horses, oxen, and cows, were grazing on it in such numbers that no one could count them from morning to night." Siegfried listened but was silent, until the old man asked him what his wish would be. "I should wish for a good sharp sword like thine," exclaimed Siegfried boldly, "and I would brandish it like a king upon this high rock, and if foes and giants and dragons should come, I would smite them with the sword, that not one should return home, and so many brave and noble heroes should stand by me, that all your granaries and herds should not suffice us when we partook our meal together. And I would go forth with them and free every country, from east to west, of monsters and oppressors of every kind." Thus spoke Siegfried, and the old man smiled approvingly, for he bethought him that the boy had spoken well. When he returned home, the young king's son could not sleep for thinking how he should one day be a renowned hero like his forefathers, who had worn the crown with honor, and had done mighty and valiant deeds, so that their fame was extolled throughout all lands, from the rising to the setting of the sun. Siegfried's masters in warlike exercises took increasing pleasure in the lad, whose eye was keen as his arm was strong and his feelings noble. None could shoot the eagle as he soared high in the air like him, nor spear the mighty boar with so sure a stroke, yet all were fond of him, for he excelled them all no less in magnanimity and gentleness than in strength of arm. If in their exercises he overthrew one of his companions, he was himself the first to help him up again and comfort him, so that no one envied him, for none was so generous and noble-hearted as he. Thus the young hero grew up and prospered, and could soon wield his falchion better even than his instructors. No wild beast was there in the woods around that he would have shrunk from attacking, and no hero drank from the cup of King Siegmund to whom he would have yielded in fight, although he was as yet but a mere stripling. Now it happened that he was one evening amusing himself in a meadow on the banks of the Rhine, in front of his father's castle, with some of his young companions, in wrestling, racing, throwing the spear, and other martial games. There was not, however, one who could throw his spear so swiftly, but that Siegfried could run after it, catch it in its flight, and bring it back to its owner. There was one alone among them who at all approached him in speed. To him he said, "Hark ye, my friend, I will dart my spear into yonder oak, and before thy hand has touched the spear, either in the air or in the tree, I will have drained my drinking horn to thy health. If I succeed, thy noble falcon shall be mine. If thou winnest, thy prize shall be my drinking horn." All who heard this deemed it a foolish offer, for the drinking horn was of ivory, richly adorned with gold and silver, and with ancient stories skilfully depicted on it. 10 noble falcons would not have matched its worth. Surely, thought they all, he has quaffed his last draught out of that drinking horn. The oaks in yon meadow are not far off, and the other lad will have brought the spear ere he shall have put the horn to his lips. The other lad thought so likewise, and gladly prepared for the trial. Siegfried now filled his horn, while all around stood anxiously watching him. With one hand he swept the fair curls from his brow, with the other he poised his spear, as if aiming at the nearest oak in the meadow. Near him stood the runner, while around him his companions watched his motions as he bent backwards and forwards to balance the spear, all full of curiosity to see how the affair would end. Siegfried now drew back, and with a mighty effort hurled the spear, smiling as he threw it. The spear flew whistling across the broad Rhine, and pierced deep into a distant oak on the opposite side. His competitor had already set off running towards the oaks on the meadow. He thought he was in advance of the spear, but turning round he saw all his companions laughing and pointing to the distant oak. Instantly he sprang into the river and swam straight as an arrow to where the spear had flown. Siegfried, smiling, emptied his richly ornamented horn to the success of the swimmer, and bade his comrades to do the like. They drank and exclaimed, "Hail to young Siegfried! Since the days of the heroes of old, no spear has been better thrown in the lands of Germany, and long will it be remembered from north to south." Presently the swimmer returned with the spear, took his falcon, and offered it to Siegfried as his prize. But Siegfried presented to him the full drinking horn, saying, "Scarcely along the whole course of the Rhine could a swimmer be found to excel thee, but thou hast tasted water enough, so refresh thee from the horn." After he had drank, Siegfried placed the falcon on his own arm, playfully put the gold band of his horn in its beak, took the hood from his eyes, and let him loose. The falcon flew with the horn into the blue sky, wheeling round and round as if seeking his prey. He floated with outstretched and almost motionless wings over the Königsberg. Then said Siegfried, smiling, "Call thy falcon off, or he will pounce upon my mother's white doves on the castle roof, and then he will never dare come into her sight again." His companion did so, and at his whistle the falcon descended straight down and settled on the shoulder of his former master. But Siegfried said, "See, the faithful creature will not acknowledge me as his rightful master. He thinks I have won the wager wrongfully, and he has therefore brought the drinking horn as the prize which of right belongs to thee. His decision shall prevail. Keep the horn, and when in the social banquet thou drinkest from it, thou and thy race to all futurity shall think of me and of my casting the spear." So spake Siegfried, and all who heard him were well pleased with his speech, and said to one another, "He has thrown the spear like a hero, and spoken as became a king's son." End of the second adventure. The third adventure of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer, by Anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. Of the Emperor Otnit and Wolf Dietrich, and how Siegfried asked permission to go out into the world. In the evening they all returned singing to Königsberg, where they sat down to table in the large hall. They ranged themselves around the fire. One cut himself arrows, another sharpened his sword, or polished his shield, or set his hunting gear in order. Meantime much was said, both mirthful and grave, of battles and hunting, of feasts and festivals. Siegfried alone sat silent by the fire, playing with the burning brands, and looked thoughtfully on the flames as if dreaming. The evening was far advanced when one of the party took down a horn from the wall and began to blow on it, whilst an aged minstrel sang a song of the Emperor Otnit, which began thus: "No longer may I tarry," the Emperor Otnit said, "for I must fight the dragon in yonder forest shade." In vain around him clinging fast hung his anxious wife. He leaves her in her sorrow and hastens to the strife. He rode about the forest, he rode the vale along, the weary way beguiling with many an ancient song. In hollows and in caverns he strove the foe to find. His shouts of bold defiance were lost upon the wind. At length he sees a meadow through which a streamlet flows. A bird sang there so sweetly, inviting to repose. The air was all enchanted, the earth was fairy ground. The very winds breathed music, and magic dwelt around. Upon a bed of roses the hero lays him low, nor thinks that near him lieth his fierce and deadly foe. In vain his hound is barking, his steed neighs loud and deep. Alas, their faithful warning but soothes him in his sleep. He dreams that he has conquered, that the mighty dragon's dead. The monster howls beside him and wakes him from his bed. In vain he grasped his weapon, the dragon o'er him stood. Alas, that pleasant meadow is dyed with Otnit's blood. When the minstrel had finished, Siegfried said, "In truth 'tis a mournful lay, and it makes me sad to think that so bold a hero should perish so miserably in his sleep. Sing us a more cheerful song, and tell us if no one came who avenged the noble emperor on the poisonous serpent." The song, it is true, is melancholy, but you youths and sons of heroes may learn from it a useful lesson, not to allow yourselves to be allured by soft voices, or lie carelessly down to slumber on roses when you are going to meet the foe. Yes, indeed, the Emperor Otnit was avenged, and this is the subject of a more cheerful song, which I will sing for you as my parting song tonight. Accordingly he began again. Say, who was beset and bravest amid the battle's rage, and who was held most famous in the old heroic age? The knight most bold and famous, Wolf Dietrich he is named. He slew full many a dragon, full many a lion tamed. 'Twas early in the morning, the hero waking cried, "Awake! Away to battle this moment I must ride." 'Twas thus he cried at waking, and sprang at once to horse, fierce giants and fell dragons destroying in his course. He rode a long day's journey the woods and meadows through, and came to Bern's fair city beside the lake so blue. He gazed upon the castle, where once in joyous mood the emperor's guests were feasted and drank the red grape's blood. And hasting to the portal, the brave knight blew his horn, and asked the silent watchman in anger and in scorn, "Now speak and say this moment, thou watchman on the wall, why Otnit's dogs are howling, why keeps his steed the stall? Why are your halls so silent, your banner darkly furled? Has then brave Otnit perished, the wonder of the world?" Responding from the turret, the sorrowing watchman said, "Respect our grief, and leave us, we mourn, alas, the dead. 'Twas on a fatal morning Lord Otnit left these walls. For this his hounds are howling, and silent are his halls. And tell me, old man, truly, before I may depart, where dwells his lovely widow, and weeps her bitter smart? Erewhile 100 maidens her truth and beauty sang, 100 heroes' sabres their glad accordance rang. A voice came from those turrets, so soft, so sad, so deep, "Sir Knight, depart in pity, and leave me here to weep. My grief is past my telling, I weep both night and day, for this is sorrow's dwelling, and now, Sir Knight, away." He only will I welcome, I ever said, who on the poisonous serpent revenges Otnit dead. And since none dare avenge him, I still withheld my hand. For this the base oppressor hath taken my golden land. So ride away, Sir Stranger, for all my joys have flown. From early morn till even I sit and weep alone. I ride not home, sweet lady, 'tis not for gold or land I come to seek your castle, with my trusty sword in hand. But giants fierce and dragons I dare to mortal strife, the sufferer and the mourner I guard with limb and life. Where pain and sorrow languish beneath oppression's might, where death appears in anguish upon the field of fight, there is my scene of labor, 'tis there I haste with speed. 'Tis there I wield my sabre, 'tis there I urge my steed. Oh, ride along, Sir Stranger, your hand is all too weak, nor on the field of danger presume your fate to seek. Thus spoke the weeping lady, a veil concealed her face, while down her cheeks of beauty her tears each other chase. That moment came a falcon, and seized upon her dove, and bore his prey so gentle to the blue sky far above. His spear the hero grasping, he hurled it swift on high. It reached the falcon flying, and pierced him in the sky. The dove returned uninjured, and sought his mistress fair. The hawk fell in the waters, and sank and perished there. She gave him from her finger a ring of gold. He said, O gentle lady, be kind as I am bold. He spoke, she closed the casement. He saw her parting form, then swiftly turned his courser and hurried like the storm. On either hand beside him a dog now swiftly bounds. They follow him, and gladly, for they are Otnit's hounds. And hasting on his sally, he rides in joyous mood, and finds at length the valley where dwells the dragon brood. And hark, o'er all the valley, what sights and sounds of ire! What mean those fearful roarings, those flames of deadly fire? A lion fights the dragon, and hence those horrors came. The lion breathes the roaring, the dragon breathes the flame. The lion bounds to greet him, with teeth so sharp, so white. The dragon crawls to meet him, with fangs of deadlier might. "'Tis well, my trusty lion," the hero Dietrich cried. "I'll help thee in the conflict, and battle by thy side." The hero braves the monster, and hurls his spear with speed. But 'gainst the scaly armor 'tis broken like a reed. Again he braves the monster, and wields his sword in ire. But it melts before his breathing like lead before the fire. Again the lion sallies, in fury to the strife. Again Wolf Dietrich rallies, and seeks the dragon's life. They wrestle and they struggle, yet seem to strive in vain, for neither yields the contest, though their blood has dyed the plain. The dragon with his talons has seized the hero's shield. The lion springs upon him, the dragon seems to yield. And now the dragon seizes the lion in its tail. Against its deadly pressure nor strength nor skill prevail. And weaker yet and weaker the brave Wolf Dietrich grows, till the dragon breathed but o'er him, and no more the hero rose. The monster bore the lion wrapped in his scaly fold, and in his jaws of fury he bore the knight so bold. But ah, his limbs were weary, and as he reached his nest, he fell for very weakness, and sank at once to rest. Then creeping to the lion came first the dragon's brood. They broke his bones asunder, and then they sucked his blood. They swallowed first the lion, and finishing their meal, they next attacked the hero and licked his coat of mail. But though they licked him over and moistened leg and arm, they cannot pierce his armor. The knight lies free from harm. And wearied thus and angered, they seize him in their sport. They throw him to each other with many a wound and hurt. They throw him each to other amid their cruel play, till sleep hath seized each brother, and all in slumber lay. So long the stars above him their nightly watching kept, so long mid his tormentors the patient hero slept. But when the sun, arising, shot forth his earliest beam, the hero then awoke him, as from some fearful dream. He rose at once on waking, and sought his sword and spear, but dragons dire and courses alone were lying near. But searching all around him what charm might aid afford, he saw, not far before him, a light and gleaming sword. The sword was once Lord Otnit's, he had borne it to the strife. That sword alone is fated to take the dragon's life. He waved it high and swung it so bravely and so true, that ere the monster wakened, his head from shoulders flew. He then assailed the young ones, he first cut off their head, and next their tongue of venom, and then exulting said, Now I return in triumph, and ask the lady's hand, for Otnit sleeps with honour, and free is all the land. When the song was ended, it was near midnight. The aged man laid himself down to rest, and the others followed his example. Siegfried alone remained beside the fire. He sat silent and motionless, watching fixedly like a man lurking in ambush for his foe. On a sudden he snatched up a firebrand, waved it on high, and struck at the flames violently, as if he would slay a dragon, whilst the sparks flew about far and wide in the ancient hall. The youth sat thus a while in deep thought, when his eyes fell on the wall where the deeds of his ancestors, the kings and heroes of old, were to be seen skilfully worked in tapestry by noble dames, how they fought with giants and dragons. Above the pictures hung their victorious swords, and the weapons with which they had conquered, and the tongues and teeth of the monsters they had slain. Siegfried, however, felt as if he dared not venture to look up at the ancient and venerable heroes, as he sat so idly there at home, and performed no deed worthy of remembrance. As he raised his eyes, it appeared as if the faded pictures became reanimated, and were looking down upon him with reproach and scorn, and he seemed to hear a voice saying, Aye, sit there like a girl by the fire, Siegfried, and warm thee all the days of thy life. That is thy place, but not abroad in the field where brave men wield the sword. Then the youth grew angry. His eyes shone bright and clear. He started up, seized the firebrand, and was about to hurl it against the figures that seemed to mock at him. But letting fall his arm, he exclaimed, Had ye be living men, and spoken to me thus scornfully, it would have availed you little, old greybeards, that ye were my ancestors. I would have shown you that I can fight like a man. But what a fool am I to be quarrelling with old pictures on a wall. I will go forth into the world this very hour, and try the fate of battle, and win glory, like my fathers, those kings and heroes. He went and took his best sword, and girdled it on his side. The large ancient shield which hung over the pictures he fastened about his neck, slung over his shoulders a rich crossbow and a horn, the one which Wolf Dietrich had borne of old, and then threw over him the skin of a bear, which he himself overcome with his single arm, without sword or weapon. Thus armed, he entered the apartment where his father and mother slept, and stood before their couch. They asked him what he was doing so early, and if he wished to go forth to the chase. Aye, truly I do wish to go to the chase, but the game I seek is the fame of a hero and the glory of the fight. And therefore I am come to ask you your leave and blessing, for I can bear no longer to sit here idle day after day like a sick falcon that with broken wing dares not venture from its nest, and I long to go forth into the world, to add to the glory of my race, as thou, father, and our forefathers, the heroes and kings from time immemorial, have done in the days of your youth. His father listened with joy to the words of the brave youth, yet not all unmixed with a saddened feeling. But the mother fell to weeping bitterly for her loved son, at the thought of the perils that his courage urged him to seek. "Nay, thou art yet too young," said his father. "Stay here a while with us, until thou art stronger. Then I will find companions to go with thee on thy heroic course." "No, that may not be," answered Siegfried. "It would be death to me to tarry longer here. Wherever I look, all seem to mock my idle repose. Night and day I have no rest, and a secret impulse drives me from my home. The thought is forever present to my mind, and when the minstrels of future times shall sing of my ancestors and of thee, and extol your deeds, they will think of me too, and scornfully exclaim, 'King Siegmund had indeed a son, strong and tall as his father, but his name is lost in the darkness of night, for he accomplished no deeds that might have adorned it. He thought only of chasing the stags and timid deer in the forest, but he never ventured into the field of manly fight.' This is my constant thought, and it cuts me to the soul more than could the keenest edge of an enemy's sword. Rather than waste my life thus ingloriously, and die like a young oak which cannot stretch itself out in the open air, let me go forth. Perchance I may return a joyous victor, or find at least a glorious death." When Siegfried's sire perceived his firm resolution, he no longer withheld his consent, but gave him his hand in testimony of his approbation, saying, "Go then, my son, and show thyself worthy of thy fathers, the hero kings. Be prudent in counsel, and quick in action. Strong be thy arm, and gentle thy mind, like the good sword, which is sharp and bending. Guard thyself against arrogance in prosperity, for that is the father of ruin. And be ashamed of cowardice in ill fortune, for such is the mother of dishonor and destruction. Avoid the discourse and friendship of the artful and unworthy, for even the smell of poisonous flowers is deadly. Trust not, my son, the false smile of the wicked, for it is like the green bog in the sunshine. Maintain thyself honorably in combat. Be true to thy word, firm in friendship, and spotless in life, for life soon passes away. And when death meets thee, and robs thee of sword and shield, helmet and spear, thy deeds will follow after thee, and for them thou wilt receive honor or shame, reward or punishment from the Almighty Father, and may he accompany thee on thy way." Siegfried kissed his father's hand gratefully and with reverence for his wholesome instruction and advice, and promised to bear faithfully in his mind and heart all that he had said as his best treasure. His parents then embraced and kissed him once more, and with hurried steps he left their presence and hastened out of the hall to the green wood, over which the morning sun was rising in soft beaming splendor.
I can't do it now.
End of the third adventure. The fourth adventure of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer, by Anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. How Siegfried the Swift went through the wilderness, and what he encountered there. Siegfried left his father's castle alone. His companions were all still asleep, and his two faithful dogs only followed his steps. He took his way up the Rhine, towards the south, over green fields, through dark forests, and across gloomy glens. The hounds bounded on before him, chasing the beasts of prey, and rousing them before his spear. Many a poisonous serpent, and many a wild bird of prey the hero slew with his arrow, and transfixed to the rocks, to mark the path that he had followed. One while he would rush forth like the hurricane that roars over the wooded heights. Then again he would stand still, and sound his horn to the barking dogs, or he sang some old heroic song, or cheerful hunting tune, till the rocks re-echoed with the sound. The clear water of the forest stream was his drink. The beasts he slew, and the wild fruits were his food. At night he slept on his shield beneath the old oak trees, with his naked sword by his side. At his feet lay his faithful dogs, who roused him whenever a beast of prey approached, and he rose as soon as the day began to dawn. Onward he went, blithe and joyous, But as yet he had met with no giant, nor the signs of any dragon, for which he longed so much. This troubled him greatly, and he said to himself, "My fathers, the heroes of old, have left me a sorry chase. The noblest game they have slain themselves, and may fairly mock at me from the old pictures. I fear in truth that but little hero's work is left for me." So saying, he vented his vexation on the snakes and beasts of prey, and proceeded onwards with increased haste and impatience, where the trees in the ancient forest stood the thickest, so that the sky was scarcely to be seen. Upon the ground the roots of the trees were closely pressed together, and so strangely entwined that Siegfried was one moment obliged to leap over, and at another to creep under them. One morning as he was hastening on impatiently, he came to a spot where the trees stood more apart. Skirting this lay a smiling mead, adorned with varied flowers and tall grass, through which ran a forest stream. Suddenly he heard a loud noise, as if some horseman were dashing through the wood. The boughs of the trees were forcibly bent back, and a snow-white stag of unusual size made its appearance. The hair on its breast hung down with age, like a beard, and its antlers, divided into many branches, were so far parted from each other that the arms of a man were unable to stretch from end to end. What most excited Siegfried's astonishment was a brilliant crown of gold that the stag bore upon his head, as he stalked proudly along like the king of the forest. It seemed as if the animal had wandered for many years in solitude with the golden crown upon his head, without seeing the face of man, for he stood quietly beside the young hero, looking steadfastly at him, as if struck with wonder. Siegfried was fain to know the meaning of the crown upon the animal's head, so he called his dogs to take the stag alive. But no sooner did he approach than the stag bounded forward, followed by Siegfried along the vale, up and down, through meadows and fields, over streams and rocks, and every time the young hunter thought to catch him, the stag escaped by a fresh leap. Thus they continued the chase, followed by the hounds, till the wearied animal came to the edge of a precipice. Deep beneath lay an unfathomable lake. The stag was just in the act of springing over when Siegfried caught him with his right hand by the golden crown, and planting his left foot against his back, he pulled the stag towards him. He now perceived that it was the same stag of which the story had often been told him, how his grandfather had taken it when young, and had placed the golden crown with a silver rim upon his head. Siegfried broke off a point from the crown as a remembrance, and let the affrighted animal run loose. Then he continued his course onwards through the wilderness, day after day, like a lion in quest of prey. It happened one evening that he was in chase of a bear in the deep and shady vale. Steep and dark rose the rocky heights to the right and the left, while from a narrow opening beneath roared a forest stream white with foam. The full moon had already risen, and cast here and there a bright gleam over the dark glen. The projecting rocks, however, with their corners and points of 1,000 varied forms, half illumined, half in shade, looked so strange that Siegfried at first fancied them no other than real giants and dragons, and dark figures of the night, of which the old minstrel sang. His ear now caught in the far distance, amid the noise of the rushing stream, the sounds of hollow blows, as if two mighty rocks were being struck and severed from each other. He hastened towards the spot, and as he advanced they appeared to grow gradually louder and louder, until at length he seemed to be in the midst of the noisy din. Yet he fancied that they must proceed from the interior of the mountain, so he applied his ear to the side of the rock, and it seemed as if he heard rough voices discoursing in a language quite unintelligible to him, and yet he nowhere saw any entrance. Again he advanced a few yards, when suddenly the valley took a turn, and he found himself standing before a high wall of blocks of stone. Rays of light gleamed through the crevices, and black smoke streamed forth. The wall was overgrown with forest plants, and below lay enormous trunks of trees. The heavy blows of a hammer re-echoed from the interior, accompanied by a hollow, murmuring sound of music as from voices. Even the rushing noise of the neighboring waterfall was overpowered by this subterranean song, which resembled the wind when in the stillness of the night it howls through the hollows of the rocks, and then suddenly rages with a loud roar over the ocean waves and forces them on high. When Siegfried had listened for a while, he climbed up to the rocky heights to see who dwelt there. Through a wide opening he looked into a deep and high-vaulted cavern. A dark red flame was burning upon a forge in the depths of the cave, whilst men of a wild aspect lifted with large pincers the glowing iron from the fire to an anvil, where they struck it with heavy hammers. Through the hollow trunk of a tree the wind whistled into the fire. Through that of another the water flowed into a vessel of rock. The dark red flame was strangely reflected on the agitated water, clear as crystal, and in the sooty faces of the smiths. On the walls hung heavy swords, old and new, of various kinds, and near them were richly ornamented shields. In the former were reflected the red and flickering flames, in the latter the rays of the silent silver moon, and they hung there and shone like large lamps. Meanwhile a shower of sparks was scattered through the cave, so that the black men seemed like evil spirits standing in the midst of the fiery element. They were of large make, but of greater breadth than height. Their faces were black as the wall itself, and their eyes beamed from beneath their bushy eyebrows, like the red flames of the forge. Stiff and bristly, their raven-black hair hung down their backs. They spoke not a word to each other, except when they laid the iron on the fire and stirred the flames. Close below Siegfried sat one of the men, who had an ox spitted upon an iron stake before a fire, and every time the stake turned round he tore off a slice and threw it into his vast mouth, to taste whether the meat were nearly done, and instantly he swallowed it down like a ravenous wolf. As soon as it was ready he took the ox from the fire, laid it on a round iron table, and cut from it with his axe as many pieces as there were men in the cavern. He laid each piece separate, and a block of stone which stood near served as a seat. Then he lighted a fir torch and went to another part of the cave, where he stuck the flaming torch into the wall, and poured out the drink from the huge casks into iron jugs. Siegfried observed all this, and said to himself, "The hospitality of these people, methinks, is small and sorry enough, but their hunger is all the greater, for truly they have enormously wide jaws. The safest thing for me will be to take my portion at once, and leave them to settle the rest among themselves." Thereupon he stretched forth his spear towards the table and seized the piece which lay nearest him. Long before the black man returned, Siegfried and his dogs had devoured the meat. When all was ready, the smith took a hammer in his hand and struck 3 times upon an iron shield, and instantly all the smiths ran, each to his block of stone, and quickly had his piece of meat in his mouth. One of them, however, cried out, "Hallo, Eckhart, thou old glutton, what hast thou done with my meat?" Eckhart looked right and left, and nowhere seeing it, he said in a muttering tone, "If ye steal the meat among you while I get ready the drink, ye may look yourselves where it is gone." "Thou knowest full well where it is gone," said the hungry smith, "nor is this the first time thou hast taken the meat and given us the bones. And if thou canst not say where it is, I'll hammer that skull of thine until thou shalt recollect." So saying, he sprang upon Eckhart, but another held him back, and a violent quarrel arose among the smiths. Some cried out that Eckhart had stolen the meat, others said that some one else must have slipped away from the anvil and taken it, while Eckhart swore hard and fast that he had not touched it. They grew more and more furious, and were about to come to blows with their hammers, when Siegfried suddenly appeared above the cave and called on them to desist. The noise, however, was so great that they heeded his presence no more than they did that of the moon, which was silently beaming on them. Then Siegfried, the young hero, put his horn to his lips, and blew with all his might so loud a blast that the whole cavern resounded, and the shields were shaken on the walls. All were silent, as if struck by lightning. But Siegfried said to them, Listen, ye rude and savage fellows. I tell you that ye are fools and madmen to wrangle thus with each other, for 'tis I that have eaten the meat. And now I pray you to welcome and entertain me becomingly as your guest. At these bold words the smiths stood even more aghast than at the sound of the horn, but they soon gave way to their rage at his presumption, and every one seized and hurled at Siegfried whatever came to hand. But quickly snatching a heavy mass of stone from the rocky wall, he cast it with such force upon the iron table that the table broke in two, and he cried, Let none raise a hand more, or ye are all doomed to death, unless your skulls are harder than your iron. Then their leader commanded them to desist from the strife, fearing indeed that there might be some mighty giant above their cave, who in his wrath would forthwith bury them within its walls. And he ordered one of the smiths to admit the stranger. The smith took a hammer, pushed away the rock from the entrance, and exclaimed, when he beheld Siegfried, Truly, I thought to see a giant, and I find a dwarf. Art thou the frog that has croaked so loud? What is thy name and calling, and whence comest thou? Siegfried answered him proudly, Thou hast asked me 3 questions, but hast forgotten the 4th, whether it pleases me to answer thee one of them. If, however, a better one than thou inquire, tell him that my calling is to carry a sharp sword, to silence insolent fellows, of whom thou seemest to be one. A name I have not yet gotten, but I come to win one. And if thou wouldst know the road to my sire's castle, the wild beasts and birds of prey I have hung upon the trees and fixed to the rocks in my way hither will show it thee. Ha! Dost thou blow again so stoutly thy horn? Answered the smith. I fain would try if thy sword is really better than my hammer. So saying, he swung his hammer round and aimed a deadly blow at Siegfried's head. But the young hero met it with his trusty sword, whose edge cleft the handle in twain, so that the iron mass fell to the earth. The smith now hurried into the cavern, followed by Siegfried and his dogs. But here Siegfried was attacked by the furious Eckhart, who rushed upon the undaunted hero and aimed a blow at his cheek with the massy tongs. Ere the blow reached him, however, Siegfried seized him with his left hand by his bristly hair and threw him on the ground. All the smiths now fell upon the intrepid youth to rescue their companion Eckhart. But Siegfried held him firmly by the hair and ran with him round the cavern, followed by the smiths. But his sword, which he wielded with his right hand, kept them off, while his trusty dogs sprang barking at their throats and dragged them down. The whole mountain trembled with the sounds of fury, and it seemed as if the savage host within the cavern were engaged in some wild marriage dance. At length the leader of the smiths commanded peace, and then, turning angrily to Siegfried, exclaimed, Hear me! Thou art in truth a most ill-mannered guest. First thou stealest our meat, and then drawest thy sword upon one of our comrades. Siegfried answered him proudly, Truly it does thee little honour to make such war upon a guest about the bone of an ox. For in faith I give thee leave to throw me into yonder fire and burn me to ashes, if by tomorrow's dawn I bring thee not, in its stead, an entire aurochs. And if thou wilt teach me the art of forging weapons, I will serve thee truly, and thy spit shall never want supplies from the forest. This offer seemed to please the master better, and he bade Siegfried welcome. Then they all sat down together, and were soon as good friends as if nothing happened. End of the 4th adventure. The 5th adventure of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer, by Anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. Mimer relates the adventures of Wieland, the best of all smiths and armourers. Siegfried took his seat boldly among the smiths, and had an answer for every question, as if he had grown up among them in the smoky cavern. Mimer imagined he had gained in Siegfried a good workman, and told him that if he served him well, he would make him as clever a smith as Wieland, the best of all armourers. Then Siegfried asked him who this Wieland was, and what he had produced. But Mimer replied in surprise, "Thou seemest to me not to have long crawled out of thy nest, if thou knowest not of Wieland, of whom every one has heard." But that is a long and wondrous history, and we have no time for it today, for Wieland forged so many skilful things that one can scarcely even tell of them. Siegfried begged him again with great earnestness, and promised to bring him the fattest aurochs of the forests far around. "Well then," said Mimer, "I will tell thee of Wieland, but remember, if thou keepest not thy word, I'll fix thee with my own hands to the highest rock, where thou shalt remain until the eagles and vultures bear thee away piecemeal." Siegfried laughed at this threat, and Mimer began as follows. Wieland, the most famous of all armourers, came from Zealand. His father was named Wade, and he was of the race of the giants. He was once told that two dwarfs lived in a hollow mountain, who understood everything that heart could desire to know, and were able to work in iron and silver and gold better than anyone else. So Wade, the old giant, took his son Wieland and went with him to seek the little dwarfs in the mountain. On their way they came to a river, but neither boat nor ferryman was to be seen. So after waiting a long time, the old giant's patience became exhausted, and he placed young Wieland on his shoulder and carried him across the river. The river was 5 fathoms deep, and yet the water scarcely reached the hem of his girdle. Thus they came safely to the skilful dwarves, and the old man gave them his son to instruct, and agreed to give them a mark of gold for 12 months. At parting he charged his son to be attentive and industrious, and then returned home. After the expiration of a 12-month he came again, and Wieland had served the dwarfs so truly and had become so clever that they would not part with him. They begged the giant to leave the boy 12 months longer, and they would return him his mark of gold, and teach Wieland twice as many arts. The old father thought this a good offer, and accepted it. But afterwards the dwarfs repented having bought his services so dear, and they required that if the giant returned not on the appointed day, they should be free to cut off his son's head. The giant agreed to this also, but at parting he called to his son to accompany him part of the way. On emerging from the mine they proceeded a short distance, when the father stopped, and plunging his sword into a bog covered with brushwood, said, "If I return not on the appointed day, and the dwarfs seek thy life, take this sword and defend thyself like a man, for that were better than that thou shouldst be miserably murdered by 2 such diminutive wretches. Nevertheless, I cannot but think I shall return before the appointed day." The father and son parted, and saw one another no more. Wieland learned all the other arts of the dwarves. They were, however, much displeased at this, but consoled themselves with reflecting that his skill would be of no great use to him, since his head was in their power. When the 12 months were drawing to a close, the old giant was anxious to go to his son rather too soon than too late, for the way was long, and he feared to miss the appointed time. He therefore set out on his journey, and travelled day and night until he came to the hollow mountain, and this was 3 days earlier than the time agreed upon. But he found the mountain closed, so, feeling extremely tired, he laid himself down to rest until it was opened, and immediately sank into a deep slumber. As he lay upon the hard rock, snoring so loud that the branches of the trees shook, the sky grew dark, a thick cloud burst, an earthquake shattered the mountain, and a cliff became loosened and fell, drowning the sleeper in the gushing waters, and burying him amidst the falling rocks and trees. Wade, the old giant, never awoke again. Some, however, say he is not yet dead, and that at times you may hear him breathe plainly, and that the whole remaining portion of the mountain trembles when he turns himself round. The dwarves opened the mountain on the appointed day, and Wieland went up to seek his father, He could nowhere find him, and when he came to the cliff and perceived the fall, he guessed what had happened. He instantly took the sword from out of the bog, returned into the mine, and slew the 2 dwarves. Then he collected together all his tools, and all the gold and silver he could find, and placing them on a horse, journeyed northwards to Denmark. After 3 days he came to the Weser, and for a long time he knew not how he should get over the deep stream. At length he felled a lofty tree, hollowed it out, and placed on the top his tools, together with the gold and silver. Beneath these he laid his provisions, and then he made himself windows of skins of beasts and bark of trees, which were so thick that no water could penetrate them. Then he slipped himself in between, and moved about until the tree rolled down the smooth bank into the stream. For 18 days in the trunk of this tree he continued his course down the stream before he reached the land, which happened just when King Nindung's people were rowing about on the sea with nets to catch fish for the royal master's table. When the fishermen drew in their nets, these were so heavy that they fancied they had caught some monstrous fish. But when they saw the tree, cut out so skilfully, they ran in haste to the king to inform him of the circumstance. The king came himself, and ordered the tree to be cut asunder to see what was inside. So they forthwith set to work with their axes. Wieland, however, who was listening inside the tree, was not a little afraid lest they might hit him a fatal blow. So he called to them to desist, saying that there was a man inside. When the people heard the tree speak with a human voice, they thought the evil spirit himself was lodged in the wood, and ran away as fast as their legs would carry them. Wieland now opened the tree himself, went to the king, and requesting protection for his life, offered him his services. The king saw quickly that he was a stranger, and a man to command attention, and not a poor wretch or wandering beggar. He therefore granted his request, although the way in which he had been taken like a fish in a net appeared to him strange and wondrous. Wieland hastened back to his tree, and buried it together with all his tools and property contained therein. But one of the king's men, named Reigen, saw him by chance while thus engaged. Then Wieland served the king faithfully, and well for a year. His duty was to have under his care and inspection the 3 knives which lay on the table before the king. He went one day to the seashore, and while he was washing these 3 knives, the best of them fell from his hand into the sea and was lost. He was much troubled at this, since he could not discharge even so simple an office. Then he went in haste to Amilius, the king's smith, but found him not, for he was gone to luncheon with his companions, and the smithy was empty. So Wieland went to the forge himself, and unseen by any human being, he made a knife similar to the one he had lost. Whereupon he went and stood before the king's table, and appeared as if nothing had happened. Presently the king took up the new knife, and was about to cut with it a loaf of bread which lay before him on the table, when the knife went completely through the loaf, and cut a piece out of the table on which the loaf lay. The king, in astonishment, inquired who had made that knife. Wieland replied, "Who else but Amilius, your smith, who has made all your knives, and everything else that you have caused to be forged." Amilius confirmed what he said. But the king answered, "Amilius cannot make so good a blade," and he threatened Wieland with his wrath if he did not tell him the truth. Then he confessed to the king all that had happened, and the king said he knew full well that Amilius could not produce such workmanship. This seemed to Amilius to convey a great reproach and insult, and he rose up in anger and declared that he would challenge the stranger to forge with him, and all should then see which of the 2 was the better skilled in the art. Then the king commanded it to be so, and it was agreed that Amilius should make a helmet with a breastplate and leggings of mail, and that Wieland should make a sword, and whoever's work was best should have the power to cut off the other's head. For the performance of the task, each was to be allowed the space of a 12-month. 2 of the chief serving men of the king stood up and bound themselves as sureties for Amilius, whose skill was so well known that it was thought impossible he should fail, whilst no one would venture to stand surety for the stranger Wieland. until at length the king himself pledged his word for him. That very day Emilius proceeded to his smithy with all his workmen, and began to labour at his work, and continued thus from day to day until the 12 months were ended. Wieland, on the other hand, waited every day at the king's table, and seemed as if he had heard nothing of the affair. Thus passed an entire half year, when the king one day asked him how he thought to gain his wager. Wieland replied that if the king were pleased to command, he was ready to begin at once, and he forthwith went to the spot where he had buried his tree. But this was broken up, and all his tools, together with the gold and silver, taken out. As he stood in trouble and perplexity, looking into the water, he remembered the man who had observed him whilst engaged in burying the tree, but he knew not his name. So he went straight to the king, told him the whole story, and added that he was sure he should recollect the man if he were to see him again. Thereupon the king said he would see to this. So he summoned an assemblage of his people, and collected together all the men in his kingdom, but none knew the meaning of the royal summons. Then Wieland stood at the entrance and watched each as he arrived. When the king had dismissed the assembly, Wieland went to him and said that among those present he had neither seen the man himself nor anyone like him, whereat King Nindung waxed exceedingly wrath, and said that Wieland was not so clever as he had taken him to be, but he found that he was a daring and presumptuous fool, and he had been himself a fool for undertaking to answer for him, and for having summoned the meeting, as the man in quest must surely have been there. So Wieland not only lost all his tools and wealth, but also brought upon himself the king's displeasure, which troubled him still more. In this strait he went secretly and forged the image of a man. He put hair upon its head, painted it, and dressed it exactly as if it were the man that stood there, for the dwarfs had also taught him this art. As soon as the figure was completed, he placed it one evening in a spot which the king would have to pass in going from the hall to his chamber. When it was time to go to rest, and the king came to this spot, followed by his attendants, he exclaimed in astonishment, "Welcome, Regan! Wherefore do you stand so lonely there outside? How fares it with your embassy to Sweden?" The man, however, was silent. He answered not a word. The king was about to question him again, when Wieland, who bare the torch, said, "Truly, sire, this man is bold and haughty. He will never answer you, for I made him, and he it is who stole my tools." Then the king laughed at the image and said, "Nay, in truth, he could not have come to the meeting." And when Regan soon afterwards returned from his embassy, he restored at once to Wieland, by the king's command, everything he had taken, saying that he had only done it in jest. Wieland meanwhile continued to stand each day at table behind the king, and served him, and did as if he had nothing else to think of, and thus passed other 4 months. Then the king warned him again, till he went to his smithy and began his work. 3 times he made a sword, and every time he brought it to the king, it seemed to him the best sword he had ever seen. But Wieland every time replied that it was not yet good enough. Then he went again to his forge, and filed it down, and made a new one of it, much better than the former. When he came to the king the 3rd time, the sword gleamed as brightly as a diamond. It was set with gold, and had a beautiful handle. Then he went with the king to the river, threw in a flock of wool which was 3 feet thick, and held the sword in the water, still and steadily against the stream. And when the wool reached the sword, its edge cut it as easily as it did the water itself. On seeing this, King Nindung said with delight that in the future he would have no other sword than this in battle, for never a better could be found on earth. Whereupon Wieland replied that he had rather the king should have it than anyone else, but he must first make the sheath and belt. So the king consented, and Wieland went to the smithy and made a 2nd sword so like the other that no one could distinguish them. The good one he hid under the bellows of his forge, saying, "Lay there, my good sword, Mimung. Who knows whether I may not want thee ere long?" From this time forward he stood day by day before the king's table. until at length the appointed day arrived. Emilius took his helmet and suit of mail early in the morning, put them on, and paraded with them up and down through the streets and market before the astonished people. The armour was so strong and beautifully wrought that all who saw it said they had never beheld the like. At the king's table it was much admired, and Emilius was assured he could not fail to win the wager. When they rose from table, the king went with all his guests to a meadow, and Emilius seated himself in the midst of an eager crowd of spectators on a broad stone seat. Wieland now hastened to his smithy, took his good sword Mimong, and went with it behind the seat on which Emilius the smith of King Nindung sat. There he laid the edge of his sword on the stout helmet of Emilius, and asked him whether he felt anything. To which Emilius replied that he felt nothing at all, and bade him cut with all his might, for that truly it must be a mighty marvel if he could injure his invulnerable helmet. Wieland then pressed upon his sword, and it cut so forcibly that at one stroke it penetrated through the helmet and head, armour and body, down to his rival's girdle. Whereupon he asked Emilius again if he still felt nothing, and Emilius replied that he felt as if cold water were streaming over his body. Well then, said Wieland, now stand up and shake thyself, and then thou wilt see how thou art. Now when Emilius shook himself, he fell in 2 pieces on either side of his seat, and never rose again, for there was no smith so clever as to be able to join the 2 parts. After this proof, the king desired to have the sword of Wieland, but Wieland was cunning, and replied that he would first dry it, and fetch the sheath from the smithy. So he went and brought the king the false sword from the forge, but he hid Mimung again under the bellows. After this, Wieland remained for a long time with the king. He made for him all sorts of curiosities, in gold and silver and other metals, so that the fame of his skill spread far and wide. Things went on thus until a foreign army attacked the country of King Nindung, and the king took the field with his men. Wieland also girdled on his good sword and went with him, and it happened on one occasion in the battle that the king was in great peril. No one came to his aid, and at length he promised to give his daughter to whosoever should assist him. Then Wieland, the clever smith, came to his aid, and performed the service required, and obtained for him the victory over his enemy. But the king, instead of keeping his promise, pretended to know nothing of it, and drove his deliverer in disgrace and shame like a dog from his court. Wieland burned with indignation against the king at this treatment, and returned after some time in disguise to the court. He went into the kitchen of the palace, gave himself out for a cook, and assisted the other cooks in preparing the food for the king's table. When the dishes were placed before the king and his daughter, the latter took a knife to carve a dish that stood before her. The knife, however, had this property, that its handle gave a sound if the dish was poisoned, and this sound was now heard. Search was everywhere made to discover the criminal, but all in vain. Wieland laughed to himself, seeing that no one knew him, and went secretly to the table, took the knife, and laid another exactly like it in its place. Then he prepared a fresh dish, and poured over it such a magic syrup that if the maiden had eaten of it, the effect would have been to make her think it impossible to live without Wieland for her husband. The king's daughter, however, had conceived some suspicion and held her knife to the dish, but it gave no sound. As she was still in doubt, she ordered another dish of poisoned meat to be brought, and as her knife would not sound, she saw plainly that there was some deception practised. Thereupon the king was angry and said, "No one can so skilfully have imitated this knife as Wieland," so he caused him to be sought for among his people. At last they found him, and brought him before the king, who as a punishment ordered the tendons of both his feet to be cut, so that he could not get away. From that time he sat constantly in his smithy, and contrived all kinds of ingenious work for the king, but all the while meditating in his heart day and night the means of his revenge. At this time he sent for his brother Eigil, who could shoot with the bow better than any other man, and had won great fame in this art. Eigil came, and on account of his skill was well received by the king. One day, however, the king was desirous to see if Eigil could really shoot as well as he had been told. So he caused Eigil's son, a boy of 3 years old, to be brought, and an apple laid upon his head, and then ordered Eigil to shoot away the apple. Although the king would grant him only 1 shot, yet he took 3 arrows from his quiver, and placing 1 arrow on the string, and taking his aim, he shot through the apple, which fell in halves. The king praised the shot, but asked him why he had taken 3 arrows for 1 shot. Eigil answered fearlessly, "Sire, I will not deceive thee. Know then that, had I not hit the apple with the one, the other 2 were destined for thee." The king received his speech well, but all the others thought that Eigil had spoken very boldly. Wieland, meantime, sat in his smithy, hammering away, and at every stroke of his hammer he uttered a curse against the king, until one day the 2 youngest sons of King Nindung came to him in the smithy with their bows, and begged him to make them some arrows. Wieland answered that he had no time. In vain they begged him again and again, until at length he promised to grant their request, if they would do him a little favour in return, namely, that when the snow had just fallen they should come walking backwards to his smithy, and then he would show them a trick. The boys promised to do so, and scarcely had the first snow fallen when they came eagerly to the smithy. Wieland, however, took them and plunged a knife into their hearts, and buried them in a deep hole beneath his bellows. They were missed the same morning. The king thought they were gone into the woods to shoot wild beasts, or to the seaside to fish. But when dinner time came, and they did not appear, people were sent out to seek them in every direction. They came to Wieland and asked if the boys had not been with him, and Wieland replied that they had been with him indeed, but had long since gone away to Königsberg. The messengers perceived the footsteps in the snow in the direction of home. No one had suspicion of Wieland, and it was supposed that the boys had been torn to pieces by wild beasts, or drowned in the sea. After a time, when the matter was forgotten, Wieland took the boys from the hole, scraped the flesh from their bones, then took their skulls, set them in gold and silver, and made them into 2 large drinking cups. Then of their shoulder blades and hip bones he made oil cups, and the other bones he made into knife handles and pipes. The king was delighted with these treasures, and only had them placed on the table when he had persons of distinction as his guests. Wieland laughed to himself at the king's delight, and thinking that he was now sufficiently revenged, he began to consider how he could return home. Then he begged his brother Eigil to get him all kinds of feathers. So Eigil went straightways into the woods, and shot all the birds he could find, great and small. Wieland made himself a winged coat of the feathers, which looked exactly like the skin stripped off of a large eagle. Then he told Eigil to put on this covering and try it. "Fly high and low as you will," he said, "only in alighting go before the wind." Eigil did as his brother told him, and flew aloft in the air like the swiftest bird. But when he wished to alight, he fell headlong with such violence as to lose his sight and hearing. Wieland asked him if anything were wanting of his coat of feathers that he had thus fallen. "If it were as easy to alight as to ascend," replied Eigil, "thou wouldst never more have seen me again, and I should now be in another land." Wieland laughed as he put the feathery covering on himself, and said, "Well, I knew that thou wouldst never bring it me again, and therefore it was that I bade thee light before the wind, for all the birds light against the wind." Then he added that he would forthwith fly home himself, but he desired first to take leave of the king, and if the king should command Eigil to shoot at him as he flew, he begged him, as he loved him as a brother, to aim straight at his heart. The 2 brothers now took leave of each other, and Wieland rose into the air and flew to the highest tower, and cried aloud so that every one could hear him far and wide, praying the king to come forth, for he had something to say to him. Then the king came with all his attendants and said, "What, art thou now become a bird, Wieland? What is thy desire, and whither art thou flying? What new miracle is this?" "Aye, sire," answered Wieland, laughing, "I am a bird now, and about to fly from hence, that thou, treacherous king, may no longer have me in thy power." Thereupon he began to mock at the king, and told him how he had appeased his revenge, until the king grew frantic with rage. And when Wieland flew on high, he turned to Eigil, exclaiming, "Come, my good Eigil, thou best of shots, send thy arrows after him, that he may not escape alive." To which Eigil replied that he would not shoot his own brother, but the king threatened him with instant death unless he did as he commanded. Then Eigil laid his arrow on the bowstring and aimed straight at his brother's heart. But Wieland held his hammer in his right hand before his heart, and as the arrow rebounded against it, he seized it with his left. Eigil was commanded to shoot again, but Wieland did as before, and flew away, laughing scornfully and holding an arrow in each hand. The king and all his people praised Eigil for his skill in aiming so well, but they were still more astonished at Wieland's dexterity, saying they had never seen the like. Meanwhile he reached his father's home in Zealand, safe and sound. What afterwards became of him I know not, but it has now grown late, and it is time for us to go to rest. Mimer's tale was now ended, and he asked Siegfried how it had pleased him, and whether he wished to become as good a smith as Wieland. Siegfried replied, "What pleases me most is the sword Mimung. As to the coat of feathers, I do not need it, for I have no thought of flying from man or beast. Still, methinks that Wieland won but little honour with all his skill. He treacherously slew his masters, the clever dwarfs, and if in return for this King Nindung was treacherous to him, he revenged himself cruelly and craftily on his poor and innocent children. Nor truly doth his flight and scornful laughing beseem a hero. But had he encountered my sword, I would not have sat so quietly to him as Amilius, the silly smith of King Nindung, nor should his hammer have availed him much against my arrows. But if thou teachest me to make a sword like the good Mimung's sword, none shall harm a hair of thy head, and thou mayest hang up all the precious stones and crowns in the world on the trees before thy smithy, and no one on earth shall dare to stretch out his hand to take them." "That we will see to-morrow," replied Mimer. "We shall then try whether you can use your hammer as well as you can your tongue. But now you must go to rest, for it is midnight, and early in the morning we shall be strong and fresh for work." Thereupon they all lay down to rest upon their skins of wild beasts. But Siegfried reposed upon his shield between his two dogs, whom he bound to the handle of his spear, and he slept as soundly and tranquilly as if he had been at home in his father's castle. End of the 5th adventure.
Right, that's where we end that, and we'll end the stream here too. And I believe that this be finished tomorrow. It might be now. I'll come back and see for the last bits, but with a little reservation, because, well,